Hello and welcome to Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley and this program is sponsored by Civication Incorporated. Civication Incorporated promotes civic learning and civil responsibility, ages 2 through death across America. We're going to talk today about something we haven't really addressed effectively on this program before. As you can see in the corner of the television screen is an interpreter. This is unique to Civil Discourse, and we have with us from interpreter source Cheryl Santana, and we thank Cheryl for doing the interpretation for this program to make it accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing. We're very grateful for that. And on the program is a professor, Dr. Carl Williams, who wrote a book. Look at this book. He wrote a book called No Limits. No Limits, a practical guide for teaching deaf and hard of hearing students. I appreciate the fact that you were here, Dr. Carl Williams. Thank you so much for joining me today on Civil Discourse.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You teach at Flagler College in St. Augustine, correct? Yes. And I just learned that you've been there over 20 years.
Yes, I have.
That's a long time, but
Absolutely.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely, I agree. I agree. I've enjoyed every minute there.
All right, so let's get right into what it is to teach deaf and hard of hearing students. This has been your expertise. This is what you've been doing all of your professional life. You wrote a very intensive book. It's gotten excellent reviews. It's published by Butte Publishing.
Correct.
It's available on Amazon.com.
Yes.
What got you interested in the deaf and hard of hearing world?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do in terms of a career path, but I did know that I enjoyed reading and writing, so I thought I would become an English major. So I attended Flagler College, and my freshman year, I declared myself an English major. Each year they would have career fairs, and each year there would be a speaker. And the first year I attended one for English majors only, and I was told that in order to make myself more marketable, that English majors should think about adding secondary education to their program of study. And I thought, well, I certainly want to get a job after I graduate, so I added that. So I was now a secondary English major. The following year, I attended the career fair for that group of students, and there was another speaker who said, if you want to make yourself even more marketable, that you might want to consider adding one of the areas of special education, because those are typically teacher shortage areas, and you would be virtually guaranteed of getting a job after graduation. So that Monday I went to the registrar's office and I added deaf education. I thought about some of the other areas of disabilities, but the sign language aspect is really what drew me. I was always interested in languages, French and Spanish, and so I thought, with deaf education, not only would this be a challenging area of study, but I could also learn another language, American Sign Language.
And that's what Cheryl is signing right now, ASL, correct?
Absolutely, she is.
And that's an interesting thing, because ASL, American Sign Language, wasn't always recognized as a language. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. For many, many years, it was thought that it was a crude form of English, that it was simply gesture and mime. But it wasn't until William Stokoe, a linguist, actually did intensive research and presented that to the linguistic community, that in the 1960s that American Sign Language was indeed recognized as a legitimate bona fide language. And in most resources it is identified as the 4th most commonly used language in the United States.
I think it's even offered as a language study to satisfy your electorate criteria in colleges now. Instead of French or Spanish or Italian or German, you can take American Sign Language and satisfy the language requirement now.
Yes, Florida was the first of several states to permit that. So in many states, students can use it as a foreign language requirement for entrance into college.
There are some stories that I've read in my education on deaf culture, that there was a time and there was a theory that not to allow deaf children to use their hands to talk. I've read about where they would actually hold the hands or fasten the hands down or make them sit on their hands to try to get them to speak. Am I reading correctly?
Yes, there are many anecdotal records that suggest that this is something that occurred. Fortunately, we don't see much of this currently, because initially when Thomas Gallaudet went to the Royal Institute of Paris to find better ways to teach deaf students in the United States.
18-something?
Yes, this was actually in 1815.
1815.
And that's where he met Laurent Clerc, who used sign language. He convinced Clerc to come back to the United States, and together they founded the first school for the deaf, the American School for the Deaf, in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1817. And it wasn't until many years later that sign language fell out of favor when Alexander Graham Bell became more prominent and advocated an oral approach. And that's when we saw more of the types of situations that you were mentioning, where sign language fell into disfavor among many, and students were not permitted to sign, and certainly were punished if they were caught signing.
So we've come a long way.
Absolutely.
A long way. And that's what education is all about, to enlighten us, to make us realize there can be a better way to do things. Interesting you say Alexander Graham Bell. Of course, he had a vested interest in people speaking. He wanted them to use the telephone.
Yes, you're absolutely correct.
Right. So you got interested in it just because you wanted to, you saw it as something that there wasn't a deaf person in your family or a deaf individual who you knew. It was something that just intrigued you.
Yes.
That's very interesting to me.
Yes, and that is very different from many of the students who come into our deaf education program at Flagler College today. The vast majority of them either know a deaf person or they have taken 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of American Sign Language and became interested through those courses. But I didn't know any sign and did not know a single deaf person when I declared deaf education as my major.
So you've been studying the deaf culture and working with deaf individuals and hard of hearing individuals for a long time. You've written a book called No Limits.
Yes.
What are some of the observations that you've made? Because you want to teach the teacher. You want to explain, right? Is
Absolutely.
That what you're talking about?
Education.
Right. Well, what you've been involved in this firsthand. What are some of the observations that you have observed?
One of the major observations, and this certainly can be a source of great controversy, because most teachers aren't going to explicitly state that I have low expectations for my students. But when I observe many classes with deaf students enrolled, based on teachers' behaviors, the level of work that I see presented at times, I could characterize that as having low expectations for students. So if I see teachers following the curriculum, and certainly if a deaf or hard of hearing student is going to receive a standard diploma, one of the things that has been advantageous for those students is that they have to follow the general curriculum of that state. So I think that that has been a great benefit for deaf and hard of hearing students, that there is the expectation that they will learn the same material that their hearing peers are learning in schools. So that would be my first observation, is perhaps the expectations are not as high as they could be.
Well, that seems to be my observation, too, just with people in general. If you set an expectation for individuals, they tend to want to meet it. If you label a student or a child a troublemaker, it's tough to beat that label sometimes, and it's hard to get away from that expectation. But if you set an expectation where the child is going to be good, the child can achieve no limits, as your book title suggests, then that child will understand that the child can achieve something beyond their imagination with the proper guidance, education, and instruction from somebody like yourself.
I agree with you 100%.
Do you see it more difficult with the deaf and hard of hearing individuals in terms of setting expectations beyond what they believe they can do for themselves?
I think that it is more problematical with that particular disability population, because there has been an observation, stereotype, actually, that the literacy levels of deaf and hard of hearing children tend to be low. And as a result, since most academic content is conveyed through the printed word, I think because individuals view deaf students as having low reading levels, that they probably are not going to attain high academic levels. And I think that's where the cycle begins. But I do think with higher expectations, more challenging curriculum, with appropriate adaptations, modifications, and accommodations, I do believe, as I. King Jordan said in his acceptance speech, that deaf people can, in fact, do anything except hear.
Well, let's say who I. King Jordan is. I. King Jordan was the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. Is that accurate?
That
in
is
1988, there was a protest that the Gallaudet University, the only deaf university in the world, never had a deaf president. And so the people said it's about time, and they got together and they were able to effect putting I. King Jordan in place.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
And he was selected by their board of trustees and had a successful run as president of Gallaudet University. As a matter of fact, it went from being Gallaudet College to Gallaudet University, and he certainly proved that adage to be correct.
So setting expectations, obviously a very good thing to do. And there used to be a phrase that's not politically correct. It shouldn't be used, but it was used, deaf and dumb. Dumb would be referring to somebody who can't speak, but it also means somebody who is not able to learn. That's not true at all. Just because somebody can't hear, totally capable of performing all of the functions of a hearing individual. Is that accurate?
You are absolutely correct. And unfortunately, the sense of dumb meaning not being able to speak intelligibly, and dumb meaning not intelligent, not smart, tend to get commingled, and unfortunately we still hear that phrase too often today.
It's still out there.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
yes.
And it shouldn't be used because it's not accurate. It's actually an offensive phrase.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. It's also an inaccurate phrase.
Right.
Because even some profoundly deaf individuals can speak, and can speak intelligibly. And therefore, it would also be inaccurate as well as stereotypical.
Setting expectations is good. It must happen. Once you set the expectations, there must be some technique in trying to affect them.
Absolutely. And that is what my book really is primarily devoted to, is helping beginning teachers, even practicing teachers, to look at their practices, to view them systematically, and find out ways that they can enhance instruction. For example, one of the things that is encouraged by the research is that every lesson begin with what's referred to as an advanced organizer, to connect students' prior knowledge with the new content that they will be learning. Unfortunately, because 90+% of deaf children are born to hearing parents and may not have received the incidental communication that hearing students might have had, that they might lack that prior knowledge. And therefore, teachers of the deaf have to spend time to build that prior knowledge so that they have a foundation to connect that new information to. So just making a small adjustment like that can yield large dividends in terms of student achievement.
We're going to take a short break, then we're going to come back. I want to talk more about No Limits, your book. No Limits, the book is right here. It's a great book for teachers and educators of deaf and hard of hearing. Take a look at this message. You're watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Civil Discourse. My name is still Ken Hurley, and you're watching a program called Civil Discourse. And we're discussing the deaf and the hard of hearing with Dr. Carl Williams from Flagler College in St. Augustine. He's been teaching the deaf and the hard of hearing for over 20 years.
Yes.
Congratulations on that. That's like a career. You made a career out of all of this. Fantastic. And look at this. He wrote a book for teachers and educators called No Limits. No Limits, a practical guide for teaching deaf and hard of hearing students, published by Butte Publishing. You can get that on Amazon.com or with the publisher directly. Professor Williams, talking about techniques. Set the expectations for children, deaf students capable of anything that a hearing student is capable of. They just can't hear, but we still need to set expectations. And then we need to, once the expectations are set, there's techniques in instructing a deaf child that might be different from instructing a hearing child. Spend a little more time talking about that.
One of the things I do want to mention at this point is that the vast majority, according to the research, 80% of deaf and hard of hearing children are currently being educated in public schools. About half of those in inclusive programs where they are not being taught by a certified teacher of the deaf, but a certified regular education teacher, and that teacher receives a consultation from an itinerant teacher and uses an educational interpreter. In most cases, this teacher of hearing students has never worked with an educational interpreter. So one of the effective techniques is getting some harmony between the teacher's presentation and the educational interpreter. For example, there is some research on the problem of divided attention with deaf students. With a teacher in a gen ed classroom, that teacher, let's say, is teaching science and is pouring a liquid into a beaker, that teacher is used to saying, now I'm pouring liquid into a beaker as he or she is doing that. Okay. The deaf child is watching the interpreter, has not seen the demonstration as the hearing children in that inclusive classroom have. So something as simple as saying, now I'm going to pour the liquid into the beaker, and then stop. Now the deaf child has seen that, now watches the interpreter who signs that. Or announcing what you're going to do in advance. Next, I'm going to pour the liquid into the beaker. The child who is deaf has an opportunity to look at the interpreter, now look back at the teacher, and actually watch the demonstration. Okay. So some adjustments as small as that
seems simple, doesn't it?
Seems simple, but again, it's not something that the general education teacher has ever done, and therefore working collaboratively and effectively with an educational interpreter is very, very important, certainly for the success of deaf and hard of hearing students in general education classrooms. And as I said, most deaf and hard of hearing students are in public schools anyway.
Well, that's an interesting thing too. There are state residential schools for the deaf in just about all of the states in the country. There might be 3 states that don't have one. Right. The one in Florida is in St. Augustine, the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. Yes. New York, for example, has several. California has a couple or 3. Yes. But most children who are deaf go to public schools, and these are public schools. Every one of them is a public school, but go to what we would call mainstream public school, and not a school specifically for deaf and hard of hearing children.
Correct.
Okay. Now, there got to be advantages, pros and cons for being mainstreamed, as we call it, and going to state residential schools. Can you spend a little time and explaining to us why one would go one place and why one would prefer to go to another?
Well, certainly one of the advantages of being in a public school program is the opportunity for deaf students to interact with their hearing peers. One of the things that I emphasize to students in my courses is when we look at the original Public Law 94-142, one of the important principles is that the purpose of mainstreaming was so that disabled students have an opportunity to interact with their non-disabled peers. And that's something that is not going to occur in a separate school program, in a residential program. Typically, course offerings in public schools are a lot more expansive. For example, if you're in a residential program and there are not enough students to offer a calculus course, then the students at that residential school who really have the ability to take it are simply not able to meet their own educational needs. So one of the advantages, I think, is a more expansive course offerings and opportunities to interact with their non-disabled peers. Certainly in a residential program, the socialization aspect becomes very, very easy, that everybody there signs. I don't have to rely on an interpreter in a classroom because
Immersed
all
in
of
the
my teachers sign. And deaf culture is very naturally passed on.
Immersed in the deaf culture.
Absolutely.
And I read somewhere where the deaf culture is actually passed predominantly through the state residential schools.
You're absolutely correct. And it's one of the reasons that there has been great concern by the deaf community with the increased number of deaf students who are attending public school programs, because that is a prime area and location for the transmission of deaf culture. They also see deaf role models, that it is very unlikely that they are going to see a deaf principal or a deaf psychologist in a public school setting. This sort of takes us back full circle to higher expectations. When I started teaching, I didn't have the luxury of thinking that deaf individuals were not proficient, because my supervisor was deaf, my principal was deaf, I was in an English department where there were 7 of us, 5 of my colleagues were deaf, and the psychologist who worked with most of my high school students was deaf, and the librarian was deaf. So even as a hearing person who had never met a deaf person before becoming a deaf education major, I didn't have to read a book to learn that deaf individuals can be successful, because I was surrounded by it. I was immersed by it 5 days a week.
By successful people who just happen to be deaf.
And that is a positive byproduct of being in a residential program for deaf students, that they don't have to read about role models. They interact with them every single day.
That sounds like it would weigh heavily, and if we were to balance this, that would be a very significant byproduct, I would think.
I would agree with you. And actually, the federal government has realized that in one of the reauthorizations of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that they added some special factors. And one of those special factors related to deaf and hard of hearing students. It said that they need to have the opportunity to interact with individuals who share the same language modality that they do. So even in public school programs, they have to seize opportunities so that those students are in an environment from time to time with individuals who also use sign language.
A lot of times people who first meet the first time they meet a deaf individual is when they've given birth to a child. That's the first time they've encountered someone who is deaf, and they don't realize the child is deaf right at birth necessarily. Could be a couple of weeks, could be a month or so. What would you say to a person of this type who now is confronted with, oh my goodness, what should I do? What should they do?
Fortunately, there is legislation that has been helping in this regard. There is universal newborn hearing screening. So in states, it's voluntary, but it's my understanding that all 50 states have programs now where babies are screened at birth. And if the screening suggests that the child is at risk for hearing loss, then those parents are given the names of agencies that provide parent training. And those parent-infant trainers go into the homes of those individuals and provide the type of parent education that is needed so that language can be provided very early on, so that social development, educational development, and psychological development are not compromised because the hearing loss is discovered later in the child's life.
It's significant language. You just brought up something that's huge that we all take for granted if we can communicate. If we have the ability to communicate either with words, through ASL, the written language. Imagine a world without language. And imagine the frustration a thinking individual would have if they cannot communicate.
Oh, absolutely, I agree with you. I show my students a number of DVD segments where a parent educator has gone into an environment where the deaf child throws tantrums regularly, is very, very incorrigible. And then they provide the parents and the family with language activities. And they go back weeks later and the child has done a 180. So I not only need language to communicate about my needs, but also my emotions as well.
Language, and that's something we tend to take for granted, those of us who have access to language. There's a book by Lawrence Siegel, The Human Right to Language, that's an interesting book. He's calling for that language to be a right, that we all have a right to language.
I agree with you, and I've read that book, and that language Bill of Rights is very important as they relate to deaf and hard of hearing students especially.
So the mom and the father who now are confronted with a deaf baby, an infant, there's organizations, there's lots of associations and groups that are willing to go into the home and help and assist, but they have lots of decisions to make.
Yes.
How do you interact with the child, the infant? How do you give the child language? How do you start? I would imagine it's a very visual approach to a deaf infant.
Yes, the very first thing that parent educator does with the family is to find out the communication modality they want to use, and whether it is an auditory oral approach, an American Sign Language approach, or even a total communication approach, that those parents are the ones who make that decision. But as you pointed out, the bottom line is it has to be a visually rich and a language-rich environment in order for the deaf child to thrive.
Okay, we're all out of time. This is Professor Carl Williams' book, No Limits. You've been watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and you can learn more about our program, Justice is Also Deaf, at our website, civication.org, where we seek to take a civic curriculum into each of the state residential deaf schools. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. You're fantastic.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed it
so much.
Thank you
very much. Thank you for participating in Civil Discourse, a program that discusses controversial issues in a civil manner. Let us know, friend or foe, we want you on our show. You may contact us in the following ways. Please email your comments to me, Ken, at civication.org, or snail mail at 4830 Atlantic Boulevard, Jacksonville, Florida, 32207, or call us at 904-591-7634. Civication Incorporated is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization.